Hello, friends and comrades, and welcome to another episode of the End of Sport podcast. I am joined today with my friend and comrade, Derek Silva. Derek, how are you doing today?
Very well, very well. As always, very excited for this conversation.
Yes, I have been since literally I was invited to be part of End of Sport. Grace was one of the first folks that popped in my mind, and I just am in such admiration of the work that Grace does. And so today we are joined by Grace McKenzie, who is a transgender athlete and former rugby player, advisory council member for the Sport and Rights Alliance, and a leading figure in the Rugby for All movement. And I honestly don't even think that covers all the incredible things that you do and that you've done. And so we're so excited to welcome you here today, Grace. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm really happy to be here as well.
They are so deserved and so warranted. And so to get things started, can you give us a pulse check on what the current global landscape is around trans athlete inclusion and how the heck did we get here?
Gosh. Well, the pulse check is we're kind of on flatline right now, unfortunately, in terms of where inclusion stands for trans people. And it's quite ironic. I was actually looking back at some memories that popped up in my phone from 2021, back when I did a marketing campaign with Lambda Legal and Milk Makeup in Los Angeles, where they sponsored the creation of trading cards of 5 different trans athletes that they made out of recycled anti-trans hate bills that were just beginning to circulate in state legislatures back then. So it was myself, Patricio Manuel, who's a trans man boxer, Mac Beggs, Fallon Fox, like some other big notable names. And I remember being like so inspired that there were these like big companies behind this, and Lambda Legal was throwing so much energy into it. And we did this whole photo shoot in LA and sent out all these trading cards, and then basically like radio silence, and watching where we've gone from there, when I think there were maybe like 30 anti-trans bills in the entire United States at the time. And this was a year after World Rugby was the first to actually ban at the international federation level all trans women from playing in the elite level of the sport, to now I don't even know what the count is, right? Over 400 or 500 across the states, and multiple FAs and international federations around the world just banning trans people full stop. It was like a domino fell kind of like within the rugby community. And then it was just a tsunami and tidal wave that hasn't stopped since then, culminating up to what we'll get into with the IOC probably and most likely coming down with a full blanket ban in the next couple of days here. So, pulse check is not great. Still in the fight and still unwilling to back down from telling my story and lifting the stories up of other trans athletes who are in this space. But it would be remiss of me to not say that it has been painfully disheartening over the years to see how much steam this hate movement has garnered.
Yeah, and I think it really is just kind of culminates in the IOC now making this big shift, an unprecedented shift, I would say, actually, and from a policy standpoint. So, can you talk a bit about like this big decision? And well, not big. Like I feel like we kind of expected it, right? Maybe I'm
Yes.
cynical.
Yes. So maybe I'll give a little bit of history. I'm not sure how much you guys have covered on the pod, though. So when I started playing women's sports, which was a year and a bit after I came out and started my hormonal transition, after having retired from a lifelong athletic career playing competitive men's sports, principally on the fact that I had internalized a lot of misinformation that was out there, even at that time, about my place in terms of women's sports being fair or safe or whatever the case may be, right? So I, even back then, self-selected out of sport, even though it took me so many years to get to that decision to come out knowing that I was going to lose access to that. Year later, much to my surprise, I got drawn into the women's rugby community. I didn't go seeking it out, but I actually got very warmly invited in, even though I had so much trepidation and fear, like stepping into that space. And at that time, one of the things that was compelling enough to me to make that leap and like have the courage to actually play was knowing that USA Rugby's policy at the time for inclusion for trans women was based on the IOC policy that was in place from 2003 under the Stockholm Convention that allowed trans women and girls to compete at the highest level as long as they maintained a testosterone level below 10 nanomoles per liter after being out on hormones for about a year, which was pretty much carte blanche standard policy across any international federation that had any rules on the books to begin with. In those 20-ish years, we saw a grand total of 0, maybe 1 trans women compete internationally. I think Laurel Hubbard had been the first who had competed like within those couple of years at Tokyo. But for many different political reasons, this fervor reached such a boiling point that the IOC was then compelled, from what I believe to be political reasons, to revisit their guidelines, not just once in the last 5-6 years, but twice now. Once basically saying, okay, we're going to scrap our eligibility criteria, which have worked without any problems for 20 years, and now have this kind of open policy where it's like, well, your international confederations you can just decide, right? We'll just pass the buck to you guys, which obviously would create a massive patchwork that was not fair or inclusive to most athletes, depending on which sport you fell in. To them even walking back further than that with the election of Kirsten Coventry, which we'll talk about here, where they're almost inevitably and imminently going to pass just a blanket ban on our participation, right? Solving a problem that doesn't exist. I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. But yeah, it's been like watching a car crash in slow motion where I'm a passenger in every single one of the vehicles, right? I'm just watching them hit the vehicle in front of it over and over and over again. That said, having been at the beginning of it with World Rugby and really getting into the advocacy space after 2 years from starting my women's rugby community journey, having that community be threatened to be taken away from me really kicked me and other people in our community to start fighting back and speaking out against these bans, even though against our best efforts, they did cascade across the sporting world, using World Rugby's approach as a bit of a blueprint to then affect people in other sports around the world as well.
Yeah, and so let's get in a little bit to your experience, because I'm very interested, and I think our listeners would be really interested in this as well. And we know that sport itself, and we've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast, is this hegemonic, often toxic, masculine space, particularly men's sports. Rugby is also an incredibly physical sport, with that attribute kind of underlying its decision to, as you've alluded, to be the first international federation to ban trans women from playing. But you've written about how women's rugby lacked, as you put it, the quote, toxicity, misogyny, and homophobia that you experienced in men's sports. And that with so much less, women are able to do so much more, creating the kinds of sporting environments that everyone deserves access to. You also described getting your ulna snapped by a cis woman in the first tackle of the first match of the first sevens tournament that you played in, on the New York Rugby Club, which is obviously painful, but clearly counters this kind of overarching narrative that trans women are the ones causing harm to other players. Can you talk us through your experience as a women's rugby player? What were the aspects that stood out for you the most? And maybe how did it differ or maybe align with what you expected this experience to be like?
Yeah, for sure. So I played high competitive men's sports across a number of different sports, right? But my mainstays were soccer and basketball, which in Canada I played at a provincial level. So I traveled around, right? And even then, I was a great athlete. I never had Olympic aspirations, right? I was there to play competitively at a high level, but to enjoy the sport at the end of the day and the love of competition, all of the benefits that it brought me in terms of learning about teamwork and resilience and how to win and lose gracefully and all these sorts of great things, right? Which is what all of us as athletes, especially as young people, are really in the sports to be doing, That said, in all of those sports that I played, we talked a little bit about this, Anna, around the heated rivalry craze and me growing up in Southern Ontario around super homophobic hockey boy culture. I only played hockey for a season because I felt left out. I was really terrible at it, but all of my guy friends were in those spaces. And, those locker rooms are just not good places. The culture is just not good. Watch the show and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about. So that was my experience, right? It was all of these benefits and upsides to playing sports with having to tolerate talk and kind of dialogue and, harmful rhetoric about people in sport who I would later learn were people like myself that they were talking about, even though I didn't understand it or know it at the time, right? Rugby, I didn't know a ton about from a cultural standpoint. Canada, it's a big rugby country, but it's still kind of a tier 2 sport relative to other things like hockey and soccer and whatnot. So I had a little bit of experience watching the game, but I had not been in the men's rugby community. I did know from other people that the men's rugby community is pretty similar in terms of homophobia and transphobia and misogyny to American men's football. It's lot of very athletic dudes who drink a lot after their games and aren't very nice to the women either, who are on the women's side or more generally, right? Not painting all men's rugby players with a broad brush. There's some incredible men's rugby players out there and some incredible advocates, especially for trans inclusion in sport. But on the whole, it still reflects some of that like toxic culture that exists. Getting invited into the women's rugby community, basically, like the way it happened is I was at a lesbian bar, and it was in a very dark period of my transition, about a year into like starting my medical transition, not really having a queer community, being in this like self-loathing space because of all the hate that you kind of internalize around you. I remember I was at a bar, and this person came up to me, a lesbian bar in San Francisco, and was like, "Hey, my name is Indigo Hansen. Do you want to play women's rugby?" And like slid a beer across the table to me. And I, in the moment, had to make that decision to come out to somebody because I was just sort of getting access to passing privilege and not really sure about like how safe I was. So I told them, I was like, "Thank you so much. Like, I would love nothing more, but I can't play because I'm a trans woman." And they looked at me and said, "Oh my God, we do, like, if you're crazy enough to get out on a pitch at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, knee deep in mud, and like take a hit or throw a hit, like we actually don't care who you are, like whatsoever." And this person was also like half a head taller than me and probably 20 pounds heavier than me, right? So I was like, okay, like open invitation, like worst case scenario, I go to practice, hurt somebody, end up on the news, and then like that's it, at least I gave it a shot. And I got to my first practice and then game later on terrified. Like I hadn't come out to everybody, but I did come out to my coach after that first week saying like, I loved practice so much. And I realized very quickly that like all of these myths that had been perpetrated and that I've internalized were just made up, because like I got my shit rocked on the pitch, just like completely leveled by girls that were twice my size. And I remember going to her in confidence and saying like, "Hey, I want you to know that I'm a trans woman. Like, I don't know what the rules are, if I'm allowed to play, but like, I really would love the opportunity to just continue to be a part of this team if possible." She went off and checked the USA Rugby guidelines, which at the time, and still for the next little while, most likely, were open to trans women based on the Stockholm Convention of the IOC, and said, "Hey, if you get your levels checked, I have your back 100%. We're going to put you in the game. If something comes up, I'll deal with it as your coach." So I remember going into my first game, I got subbed in because one of the wingers had her nose broken on like a tackle. And my coach was like, "Okay, you're in." And I was like, "I have no idea how to play this game. Like, I've literally been to 2 practices. I barely know the rules." And she was like, "Run forward, hit somebody. If you get the ball, just run as fast as you can." And I was really fortunate that some like weird errant bounce happened on the sidelines when I was on the winger. And I caught it and ran all the way down the pitch and got into the try zone thinking I had scored a touchdown. And all of my teammates are screaming at me to like put the ball down, because in rugby, you have to like touch the ball in the touch zone and you can't actually just like walk over like a touchdown. And I was like, holy shit, all these people are going to like tackle me. So I put the ball down, scored my first try. And literally right after it, it was like all your teammates embrace you. You do a social right afterwards. You have to do this disgusting thing called shoot the boot, where they fill up like an old like cleat from the game with beer, and you have to drink it to like celebrate you scoring your first try. And from that moment, I started to de-thaw around my disbelief of my ability to participate in this. And as I did slowly come out to my teammates, as I felt more comfortable, it was nothing but love and warm reception. Like, we don't care. You're a part of this team. You play great. Here's the things you can improve upon. And I was never the best player on the team. I never had national team aspirations. I did want to play as best as I could. But, those first 2 years where I didn't have to face all this hate that had been focused on trans athletes for so long, were the 2 happiest years I've ever played in sports. And the team that I played for, they're called the Golden Gate Women's Rugby Club. They're not in operation anymore, but they're in San Francisco. And they were associated with a men's side. So we had a clubhouse on Treasure Island in SF. There was a men's team, and we had the women's side as well. And that was probably my first experience seeing the dichotomy in support resources, access to equipment, field space, all these sorts of things that were so imbalanced, even within a club that's supposed to be equal and unified, right? Like, the women always got the worst practice spots. We always had to practice on the shitty field, like covered in goose poop, like we didn't have the best equipment. Like, we would be fighting for refs, and that was discrimination and exclusion coming from within our own club. But even with all of that, like, it was still one of the best organized sporting environments I'd ever been in. It was all organized and run by women. You know, we were constantly fighting and advocating for ourselves at the like larger club executive board, but doing so with a lot of ferocity, right? And we were able to do some incredible things with that club. It wasn't until I decided to play with a more competitive side where I moved across the bay to the Berkeley All Blues, who, a lot of people don't know this, are the only women's rugby club in North America that has never been associated with a men's side since like the 1970s, right? Which is super, super unique and unusual. And that is, to this day, the most high performing sporting environment, most well organized sporting environment, most inclusive and accepting sporting environment I have ever experienced, to the point that once the World Rugby ban happened and I started my advocacy career, starting Rugby for All and all this sort of stuff, they, out of the blue, just sent me a $200 scholarship for the work that I was doing and said, we're rewriting our entire charter to ensure that it's trans inclusive. And I was like, I don't even know you girls. Like, I literally have played against you. You've kicked our ass a number of times. And that was what really prompted me to move over and say, like, I actually have a chance to compete. Like, I don't just have a chance to participate and drink with my friends. It's like, I can actually push it, and maybe I have some aspirations to play at a higher level. So that was really the big difference. And, you know, as I connected with women's rugby players and clubs not just within North America, but through my advocacy work all over the world, it was a super similar experience, right? It was like, we are doing way more with way less for the love of the game and the love of keeping the game open to everybody. And it taught me really, really quickly not to take for granted the limited resources that we had, and to constantly be in awe with what women's rugby clubs and folks who are not cis men who participate in those spaces were able to do just out of a love of the game. You know, it's like, it's the purest appreciation and love for sport that I have ever been able to experience as either a male or female athlete.
Now, you've alluded to this a little bit, but how did all these experiences kind of inform your role in starting Rugby for All?
Yeah, sure. So the timeline of what happened, 2018 to 2020 was when I had been playing. Things had slowed down or started to slow down with COVID a little bit. You know, training was being adapted as we were learning more about like shelter in place and whatnot. But around end of 2019, we started to hear through the grapevine that World Rugby, who had just updated their trans inclusion policy in, I think, 2018 or 2017, where they actually made it more accessible to trans women. Like, they removed a surgery requirement, you know, that I think they actually limited the testosterone threshold down to, or up to 10 nanomoles per liter, or 5 nanomoles per liter. A little bit fuzzy on that. But we then started hearing that, hey, they've just decided to revisit the rules they just revisited. And I was getting into the place where I was starting to really understand the like anti-trans or trans exclusionary hate machine that was like really spinning its wheels up back then, like the J.K. Rowlings of the world and Fair Play for Women, and how this like insidious network was being built. And then we started digging into it and we're like, oh, who has been invited to be on this working group? No trans women rugby athletes, no trans male rugby athletes. Joanna Harper, who's wonderful, was the one trans person on the actual voting working group, but she was also quite early in her like research career and her studying these things. And I don't think had so much of a big name in like the academic space at the time. But the other people who were involved were like the leader of Fair Play for Women, which is a notorious anti-trans group in the UK, who says that they're about fairness in women's sports, yet you go to their website and they also advocate for keeping trans women in men's prisons and rolling back the Gender Recognition Act in the UK. There's like horrible things that are then shaded by this guise of protecting people in sports, which is their tactic for just like extending people's belief in transphobia and their comfortability with it. There's like people like that. And then it was like John Pike, who we'll get into talking to as well, who's like a sports philosopher, or whatever that means, at one of the more transphobic universities in the UK, who was for some reason an expert relative to people who actually have any connection to rugby whatsoever. And in spite of the working group composition, you know, this is before I started realizing that these groups were never formed unintentionally, right? Like, the membership was intentional because they always had predetermined outcomes. We submitted like hundreds of pages of testimonies, partnering with International Gay Rugby, which is a fantastic organization around the world, from trans athletes, cis athletes who support their trans teammates and opponents, testimonies, science at the time that even back then was still not super conclusive about advantage or lack of disadvantage, but was definitely not conclusive about there being a disadvantage to cis women when competing with trans women. And we put all this in thinking like, oh, this is a rational working group that's going to make a fair decision, and like full blanket ban, no consultation, no engagement with us whatsoever. So myself, I was like, this is bullshit. Like, I'm not going to lose access to this space that it's saved my life, in terms of the hard early days of transition. So I started a petition kind of on my own through change.org, calling on the like international rugby community, specifically women's rugby, to say, hey, World Rugby, what you're doing is a mistake. You need to come out and speak forcefully against this. We garnered like 25 to 30,000 signatures from players and like advocates and people involved in the community from around the world. Olympians were signing on, not just in the US, like some amazing people like Alev Kelter and, Kate Zachary, but also like some of the Roses in England and like people from different parts of the world who had played with trans women and did not care because it was just a part of our community. And all of that, again, didn't influence them to change their decision whatsoever. So once that happened and I realized, okay, this is like a war we're in. This isn't just a single battle. Myself, some other really fantastic people in the US women's rugby community, we started something called Rugby for All, which has now for years been doing educational advocacy work, conversations and like speaking on panels and things like that, like where you and I met, Anna, engaging with Olympians. Like I've had some really amazing conversations with some of the 7s and 15s Olympic players from the women's side. And just having that opportunity to like not only educate the population that's at Broad, but also say like, hey, there are people behind these horrific decisions you're making, right? And like, I am always willing to put my face and name out there and be like, you're not just talking about an abstract concept, you're talking about somebody like myself who's had a lived experience and is actually willing to talk to you about it, as opposed to getting your news from the Telegraph or from the Daily Mail or from the New York Post, or like not actually talking to trans people and just listening to people who don't want us to exist talk about our experiences without having any lived connection to it. So that was kind of like what kicked everything off. And then I blinked and 6 years later and still talking about this, still educating, still advocating, unwilling to back down from it. But it unfortunately feels like this freight train that we tried to get in front of with all of our might did leave the station and kind of hit every other sports station along the way with these bans, culminating with what we're going to probably see at the IOC in the next little bit here.
Yeah, it's just bananas how, like you said, it's a freight train, and they just the anti-trans crowd, policymakers, the J.K. Rowlings, the John Pikes, they keep coming back to this phrase of them saving or protecting women's sports. And I think it's really important that you explicitly said, like, rugby saved your life. And that's the
Yes.
this idea of saving and protecting is a really compelling term, and it's taken up in a lot of different ways. Why do you think this anti-trans crowd is using the idea of saving or protecting? Like, what do they think needs saving or protecting? And what do you actually think needs saving or protecting based on your experience in sport?
Yeah, well, I always say, I'm like, if you think myself or especially my cis rugby teammates need to be saved or protected from people like me, I would invite any of those people who have no connection to the women's rugby community to just come to practice. Get on the field, put your mouth guard in, and see who needs protecting, right? I can guarantee you it's going to be John Pike. It's not going to be myself. It's not going to be Alona Mayer, Protecting women's and girls is a dog whistle, and it is to be perfectly blunt, far-right, ultra-nationalist, white supremacist, Nazi dog whistle, right? We have not seen this for the first time in this trans athlete argument, but it's obviously in all of the anti-trans hate arguments generally. But look back to the 1970s and the 80s with Anita Bryan, right? What was she saying in the States about her anti-gay and homophobic advocacy? We need to protect the sanctity of marriage, and kids are going to be influenced to become gay and stray from the light of God, or whatever the hell they wanted to say, right? And we saw that in the marriage equality debate in the States. It was like, well, we can't let gay people marry because then they'll adopt kids. And if they adopt kids, what's stopping, homosexuality from digressing into bestiality and pedophilia, which is very ironic now with everything we're talking about, right? And it's just like, it's this trotted out playbook and rhetoric over and over and over again. It makes me so sad that the average person is so uneducated and like not political enough to understand how easy it is to get people to believe this. Because like, who doesn't want to protect kids? Who doesn't want to protect women and girls, especially people who believe that women and girls are completely defenseless, powerless, and need the protection of white male patriarchy, which is a myth that the entire power structure is based upon, right? But I always flip the script and say, okay, statistically speaking, who within the category of women or girls, if you're going to give me the default assumption that trans women and girls exist within that category, actually need protection? Is it the 1% of 1% of the population who are extraordinarily marginalized from every aspect of society, socioeconomically, in terms of the risk of sexual violence, lack of education, opportunities for employment or housing? Or is it the white, wealthy, cis female athletes like Riley Gaines, who turned a 5th place tie with a trans woman into a multi-million-dollar grifting career, traveling on Fox News, talking about how she had all of her opportunities robbed from her? I'm going to say it's probably the trans girl in Oklahoma who is suicidal because she just got kicked off of her girls' soccer team that she's played for the last 6 years since she was 4 years old. Those are the people that I actually care about protecting, right? But the sports issue, whether you're even talking about this whole protecting women or girls thing, or if you're coming from the like fairness angle, sports are inherently unfair. You guys have talked about this a million times. It's always under this misogynistic assumption that women and girls and people who are not cis men are always weaker, always less fast, always less strong, never going to have any opportunity to compete at any level against any person who is not a cis woman themselves, and specifically a cis white woman. Like, it's a specific category of women we're talking about. They don't care about Castor Semenya. They don't care about black and brown women from the South. They care about the white women who they're supposedly protecting, right? And in my sporting community, you talk to an actual women's rugby player, especially at the high level, and say that they need to be protected from other people, and they're like, have you seen my body after I play a sevens match? I just ran a half marathon and I have bruises from head to toe, and I'm going out drinking afterwards. You really think I'm the person who needs to be protected? I'm pretty sure it's these fragile, trans-exclusionary radical feminists who are sitting behind their computers, not ever playing a sport ever, who might be the ones who need to be protected from their own self-hate.
Yeah, listen, you are so spot on in terms of the fascist scapegoating that this project, this anti-trans project, always has been, and will continue to be. That analysis is so poignant. I think you gestured to this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of the biggest myths about trans athletes, particularly in the those competing in the women's category. And why do you think that those are so pervasive and in some ways compelling?
Yeah, so let's start with the fundamental science, right? So the way that the sports issue is used as a wedge to get people comfortable with transphobia in other areas of society is because, first, if you're not an athlete, you don't understand why sports are important. You look at sports as a luxury, not a right, or a privilege and not a right, So it's easy for the well-meaning liberal who still is like, well, I support trans rights, but I don't know about the sports issue, to say like, well, why does it matter? It doesn't matter if this person can participate in sports. Why are you making such a big deal about this, right? And it's like, we all know sports is not just you going out and competing for a medal. It's like everything that I said. It is teamwork, life lessons, having the protectiveness of a community, being included, having opportunities. If you want to talk competitiveness, of getting out of the cycles of poverty, right? Getting the opportunity to travel, getting the opportunity to play in different parts of the world and go on to prove to yourself that you can be more than what you came from based on the cards that you were dealt, right? So that's the first thing. Like, people just think sports is no big deal. It's the farthest thing from no big deal. And if they believe their own bullshit, if they're talking about protecting the women's category, why are you protecting it if it's not a big deal for these women? It's obviously a big deal. That's why Title IX exists. But the second step from that is when we talk about our assumptions about the physical capabilities of human beings, And we all believe misogynistically, because we live in a patriarchal society, even folks who have done the work and who are allies, that at a gut feeling, men are always better than women no matter what. We know this is not the case. We can see it in the science statistically. We can see it in the Olympics in terms of how women's categories came to be in a lot of sports. Oftentimes it was because women, when they were introduced into mixed gender competition in certain sports like shooting, biathlon, these sorts of things, were out competing male counterparts, because cis women are folks who are in estrogen, kind of driven bodies. Oftentimes they're better at precision sports and shooting and archery. You'll see historically that they will be allowed to participate mixed gender over history. They'll start out competing the men. They'll get banned. And then 2 cycles later, a women's category will come out and be open so that they can go and compete, but not hurt the men's feelings by stealing medals from them, right? So even there, it's just like thinly veiled political bullshit. But that belief is so pervasive in our society, and this like infantilizing protectionism that needs to come from men for women, that if you don't know trans people and you have no understanding beyond an 8th grade or lower level of human biology, and you just assume that trans women are not physiologically different than cis men in any ways, which is a lot of what this bullshit science tries to slip the wool over people's eyes about when they claim that there are these biological disadvantages. You don't understand how hormone replacement therapy works. You don't understand anything about the trans experience because you've never bothered to talk to or listen to a trans person. It's easy to make the logical jump from trans women are no different than men, and men are better than all women at all things. And therefore, if trans women are men and men are better than women, then trans women should not be allowed to compete with women because they're automatically better than women, right? The actual experience, and this is in the science, especially most recent science that's come out within the last couple of months, showing that a lot of trans women may have disadvantages in certain sports based on hormone replacement therapy, which were the common sense regulations in place for so long in terms of people's participation. And I can talk about that in a little bit, because there is some difference in opinion within our community around hormone replacement requirements and things like that. But talking about my own experience as an athlete who tracked my performance, really good example. When I started my hormone replacement therapy and did testosterone suppression, I was a competitive rock climber. So I was climbing under the US grading system, usually between V6 and V8, depending on the bouldering routes that I was doing. And over the course of a year of transition, I've been climbing for 16 years. So this was at the peak when I was in San Francisco and climbing in Yosemite. I went from that over a year of not really climbing very much, because again, I had a lot of internalized self-hate about my athletic ability, to dropping down to a V2, V3 level and having to completely relearn how to climb because I lost so much muscle mass. My VO2 max diminished tremendously. The amount of fat content in my body relative to my muscle mass changed. So my center of gravity actually changed. So for me to even get up to not nearly as well as I was climbing before, I kind of pivoted to rugby. So it wasn't my main focus at the time. I had to completely relearn how to be an athlete in that sport, much more focused on flexibility and being intentional with my movements and body positioning, which is why you can still see cis female climbers climbing at the highest echelons of bouldering and outdoor rock climbing, but they do it in a totally different way, right? Much more graceful, much more elegant, much more thoughtful, in my opinion, than just relying on brute strength. So I was able to actually see my decrease in performance over time. I watched my mile count in terms of running, my time, go up because my VO2 max came down, and I had less muscle mass to propel the same or slightly heavier frame because of how much muscle transitioned into fat within my body. We hear this a lot about bone density, right? When you go through male dominated puberty, so your bones are denser. So again, you can't reverse that advantage. And it's you have such a limited and lack of understanding of how physics work. If I have the same bone density and the same mass within my bones, but a smaller engine to propel it, I'm actually outputting less power. I'm going faster. If I'm in a contact sport, I'm going to hit less hard. I'm going to be able to run for less amount of distance and at a lower speed, right? But it's these are just little scientific understandings that the average person would rather go with their gut feeling about men always being better than women than actually sit with and think about the nuance of. How could we fix that? If there are enough trans athletes, you could just watch one of us play or talk to one of us, or I don't know, read excuse my language, a fucking textbook that will teach you anything about biology, right? Maybe
language
is
totally fine for this podcast.
Great. Okay. I swear like a sailor. I lived in New York for a while. So, but, It's just, I'm an I studied organic chemistry, right? So it just drives me absolutely bonkers knowing that I'm having arguments with people who have like stopped taking science class at 6th grade and they think that they know everything about this like false binary that exists within the human body, which is so much more complicated than that, right? So that's really what it comes down to. If you don't know that hormone replacement therapy can make these changes within the human body in a short amount of time, even if you want to be conservative, maybe it's 2 years you have to be out of the sport before you can play again. We don't see science that is actually well done with a high enough sample size, like an N, above like 30 or 40, which some of these bullshit papers they use to justify bans are actually based on, that there is a retained advantage. And if not, again, potentially disadvantages depending on the sport and the specific discipline within the sport, which is something that Roger Plecky during the Play the Game conference was really, really good at expressing on stage. He was a bit of a wild card. I had not really interacted with him. So I was like, I don't know where this guy's going to come out on this debate. And he was like, it's not a black and white issue because human bodies are not black and white. Some sports, there might be an advantage. Some sports, there might be a disadvantage. Some disciplines within certain sports, you may have one or the other. Rugby, great example. You have people who are 4'11" in the women's side and maybe like 110 pounds going up against 6'2", 220-pound props. Scrum half versus a prop. It's not like you're not allowed to tackle each other. It just means that this person has a very different role on the field, is likely not going to get rocked by the prop based on the positioning they have on the field. But the prop could not do the scrum half's job and the scrum half could not do the prop's job. And the beauty of rugby is you can have a person from that small stature and size all the way up to the larger one still compete effectively and successfully in their position on the field and in their role. And that's what I think makes rugby the most beautiful team sport out there, because it is not one shape, one size fits all, right? And in the women's rugby community, that matters so much more beyond just talking about trans people. It makes it an inclusive space that's body positive, that's accepting of folks of all age levels. Like as you age, you change positions. I changed positions as I aged within my sport, right? And it was like, holy shit, this is amazing because there isn't just one archetype of what a women's rugby player looks like. You talk to like Alona Mayer is one of my inspirations. I think she's like a couple inches away from actually being a vocal advocate for trans inclusion in sports. But, her whole thing about like, you can be broad and strong and beautiful and rock red lipstick and you're still a woman. Doesn't matter how many death threats I get. I'm not going to change who I am just to fit your ideal feminine beauty standard. And I don't think you would see that kind of rhetoric come out from any other sport besides rugby, where you are trained to understand that you need to have a diverse set of people within your team to be a successful team on a national or internationally competitive stage like that.
Yeah, and I couldn't have said it better myself. And I love how, people are just relying on their gut feeling or the fact that they have decided to become a philosopher of a particular topic of which they may not have a lot of experience. But speaking of areas that perhaps they don't have training in, and you mentioned this in what you just said, you and I met at Play the Game in Finland in October 2025. And like, what a pleasure, what a great conference. And we met because you were in this really highly attended, highly anticipated panel about trans athlete inclusion. And Kareem Zidane, who has been on this podcast, he did a recap after the event and noted that in his pre-panel conversations with Stanis, who organized the panel, that Stanis had continually reiterated that dialogue was the only way forward. And in his piece too, Kareem mentions that he chatted with you briefly also the following day, and that you'd remarked that you waited years for this moment, with that moment being to face John Pike, whose work was pretty foundational to World Rugby's outright ban on trans women athletes. You're no stranger to the big stage, though. Like, for me, I was like, oh my God, like, Grace is amazing on this big stage. I would be shitting my pants right now. But, like, you're no stranger to this because you had a feature in the New York Times in 2020 regarding the World Rugby ban, but you also said no to other interview requests, like the same year with Piers Morgan and Good Morning Britain. So can you talk about your decision to participate in this panel and how you prepared for it as well?
Yeah, definitely. So, like, John Pike being an instrumental contributor to the ban, I think is giving him a lot more credit than where credit's due. Like, instrumental competitor of him just being an old white dude who has opinions on things. Like, I know they get a lot of credit for that across like academia, but he hasn't actually done any research or published anything relevant to this. He's been like sub co-authors on papers that were, in my opinion, talk about this a little bit, like papers by, in some cases, well-meaning like hardline academics in sports physiology who didn't realize that their research was being hijacked by people with political motives, like Emma Hilton's or John Pike's or whoever the case may be. I actually had a really good conversation after one of the sessions with one of the Norwegian or Danish authors of one of those papers, where I was like, hey, did you know that Emma Hilton is connected to these J.K. Rowling groups where beyond the sports issue, because again, she's a entomologist, like microbiologist for bugs, has nothing to do with sports science, yet seems to be very, very interested in this topic. Did you ever look into like her CV or the work that she's done, or I don't know, maybe check on Twitter to see what kind of like hot takes she has? And he had no idea. He was like, well, I'm just doing the science. I'm like, science doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So those are some conversations I had. It was very elucidating for me about like how reputable researchers can get pulled into this sort of research that is politically motivated and has animus. But in terms of that opportunity at Play the Game, and I got invited to do so after I was brought into the fold with the Sport and Right Alliance. So shout out to Andrea Florence and Joanna as well from that organization, because I had been originally invited from ILGO World, which is a really, really amazing international organization fighting for trans, intersex, and queer people in sports and other areas as well, to speak about my experience as a rights holder at a UN Special Rapporteur session. This was going to be, I think, when was this? A couple of years ago now, probably 2023 or 4 in October. So I spoke at that, and then I got looped in with them saying, hey, we don't have any trans athletes on our advisory council right now. Would you be interested in being somebody who helps us shape our policy decision-making and, the advocacy work that we do, the amazing work they do with the Survivors Network they have, etc. I said, absolutely, that's great. And they said, hey, okay, so there's this opportunity at this conference called Play the Game. It's very well attended, international context, a lot of journalists from all over the world. They want to put together a panel, which effectively turned into a debate, talking about where trans athletes fit into sports, right? And this is when I first got connected with Stannis. And I learned from Andrea and the folks at Sport and Rights Alliance that I was not the first person that was asked to be on this panel. Stannis has actually reached out to a different trans feminine athlete who said, absolutely fucking not. If John Pike's there, I'm not subjecting myself to being on stage with a man who has so much preconceived hate about my involvement. And I would never, ever fault that person for turning down that invite, right? Because we're in a world where if you put your neck out there as a trans woman in particular, and you catch the wrong wave of the internet, you get posted on X, J.K. Rowling retweets you, your life can get ruined pretty quick. You can get doxxed, you can get death threats, you can get shit sent to your houses. Like, it can be horrible, right? We've just seen what happened with Leah Thomas with the UPenn shit, where Trump made them capitulate and basically strip her of all her medals and have the university send out these ridiculous apology letters for letting her compete. Basically just like ruined this girl's life, because he threatened to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars to funding for Penn under his bullshit executive order, right? So like, that's the risk of going out there and speaking. When I went to Rugby for All and some of the folks who were involved in that organizing, I said, I'm thinking about doing this, like there's an opportunity for me to actually get out there with it like a Louisville Slugger and swing back against these people who've been fighting. I had somebody say, do not do that. That's ritual suicide. It's not worth it. And I sat for a month and a half saying, like, is this really something I want to subject myself to? I have been lucky and fortunate enough to not have like made international news or ended up on Fox News or had any of those horrible things that oftentimes again get targeted and projected towards Black and brown trans women or intersex people, folks who don't have the numerous privileges I have as a white woman. But I did a lot of reflecting on it, and I said, no, I know there's going to be people there who have my back. I'm a rugby player. I don't really back down from a challenge. This is an opportunity to get on stage with one of the people who has made my life and other people's lives living hell just for being the people that we are. And at the end of the day, I'm very fortunate. I fled the United States for my safety in August because I had the privilege to do so, come to Amsterdam and start a business. So I'm like, I don't even have a permanent address yet. What are they going to dox? I'm in a safe place that accepts trans people. I've retired from my sport because I had a career-ending injury like earlier that year, like later in the year previously. So I said, screw it, I'm going to do it. I was terrified, like absolutely terrified. I didn't know how this was going to go. And like, even having Stanis being like, yeah, the best path forward is dialogue and it needs to be an open conversation. Like, I agree with him and I think it went well. And even though I had some criticisms of how the panel was like run and facilitated, overall, it was done quite respectfully. But there is this understanding that like there's a line between what is productive and healthy conversation and debate and what is a public humiliation ritual that's going to put you at physical, mental, and emotional safety or a risk of safety, right? And I think oftentimes hard-nosed academics or people who don't have like skin in the game as a trans person or no trans people don't get that like debating your existence in human rights is not actually a debate. It is one side having a hateful, violent, genocidal opinion about you and you begging for people to give a shit that you're alive, you know? I don't let those conversations go in that direction. Knowing that this was going to be unedited, like televised, live streamed, I knew what I was walking in with. I knew that at the end of the day, it was my lived experience of playing 7 years of uninterrupted, joyous women's rugby at high levels of the game with no issues ever from teammates, competitors, refs, anybody whatsoever. If anything, overwhelming support for my existence against, you know, a number of people, not against, but there are a number of people on the panel, many of them pro-inclusion, a couple of them ambivalent or like questioning, and then John Pike, who's like clearly just an antagonistic anti-trans voice. And I was like, I'm going to get out there, and at the end of the day, it's my lived experience against your philosophical beliefs. So there's really nothing I can say that you can refute because I lived it and you can't take that away from me, you know? So I went up there and the conversation I don't think could have gone any better. There was nuance involved, you know? Joanna talked about her research and how there are some inconclusiveness in the findings, but like more and more research that comes out points to no competitive advantage, if not, you know, sometimes disadvantages for trans people. And I think I got John Pike so flustered at one point that he questioned whether I had a brain on stage in front of an auditorium of 400 people and a live streamed audience of like thousands. You know, I
Yes,
came
he
back onto
did.
Instagram, which I had shut down for fear of public retribution. And I invited people to, hey, tune into this. Like, I haven't been online for a while, even though all of my advocacy work had been done on that for years. I was like, this is going to be my Hail Mary opportunity. And I think I had like 12 or 15,000 people respond to that post and share it and like view it, and from all over the world who I'd played with and all over the states who I'd played with. And it was incredible. I remember walking off stage feeling like there is not a single thing I could have said differently that did not make me proud about the experience that I'd had and the ability to use my privileges as a white woman, somebody who passes, somebody who is in a safe space to stand up for folks who don't get to have those conversations. The best way to exemplify how I think the panel went is if you check John Pike's Twitter, where he is nonstop tweeting about how much trans women deserve to not exist in the world. He didn't say a single thing about the debate. There was no commentary. There was no response. You know, I was expecting him to sick the like death threat hordes on me and like tap his buddies like J.K. Rowling or whatever to blow this thing up. And kind of interesting and ironic that he was just dead silent about how it went. So if that tells me anything, I think we defanged his arguments in front of a group of mostly supportive, if not ambivalent people who then I think had a much more nuanced and supportive approach and thought about how trans women can be included in sport.
Yeah, the silence is telling there. Absolutely, absolutely. Let's shift gears just a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about Sport and Rights Alliance. This group focuses on making and creating safe spaces in sport for people affected by abuse, and is comprised of athletes, lawyers, academics, allies, etc., from around the world and from different walks of life. It's an organization that we would characterize as actually doing the hard, actual work of quote unquote protecting women's sports. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization, your work with them, and how you identify issues in sport and enact systemic change to what we know are systemic problems?
Yeah, sure. So Sport and Rights Alliance is one of the most incredible international sporting advocacy groups that I've ever had the pleasure of being a part of. And I'm so honored to be an advisory council member for them. So I'll talk about my involvement. So the advisory council is a group of like non-voting board members effectively who are called upon based on our lived experience and our connection to different areas of the policy work and advocacy that they do to help inform their decision making in terms of where to engage, how to make the organization more operationally efficient, etc. So obviously myself, I'm involved because I'm a survivor of violence from a transphobic perspective in terms of my experiencing sport. And I try to be a mouthpiece and a vocal advocate for people who've experienced significantly more violence for being trans or queer in sport than I have even in my playing career. So that's where I fit in on it. And, like I help them pulse check how their writing about queer and trans athletes is like inclusive. And have you talked to enough trans people? And, are you making sure that you are countering the myths and the misconceptions? Because they're so rampant, even people on the right side sometimes can get caught up in it or like not necessarily say it correctly. So I pride myself on being that kind of like voice in the room where it's like, no, I'm actually trans. Like maybe we should rewrite this or like say something here. And they're always fantastic about it. But beyond that, they do some amazing work for people who are impacted by other forms of violence within sports. So, sexual and gender-based violence is a huge part. It was like what was one of the motivating factors for actually forming the organization in the first place. We do things like advocating to the IOC and FIFA like directly about their safeguarding policies or lack thereof, in my opinion. We adjudicate an emergency response fund where we give out grants to people around the world who have been impacted by violence and injustice in sport to help them out, whether that's like the Afghan women's football team that was run out of the country by the Taliban taking over control, or coaches who are facing retribution for standing up for their players who whistle blew about being sexually assaulted or experiencing violence in different parts of the world. So I get a chance to sit on that group where we make a decision every quarter about who we can adjudicate the funds to, funds that we are trying to expand in terms of looking for like new funders and donors. So if anybody listening, is a part of an organization that's looking to support initiatives like that, like please get in touch. We would love to talk. And then there's also the research angle of it, right? So we do actual research into the effects of violence and injustice against athletes across all modalities of sport. And we put out working papers and research papers and press releases and things like that to basically counter a lot of the harmful narratives that are coming out. So really good example that's relevant to our conversation. When the IOC, I was actually at a meeting with them with the Sport and Rights Alliance, they announced Christy Coventry's 4 or 5 working groups that she came out with, one of them being protecting the female category within sports, the only one of which the entire membership was obscured and was kept hidden in terms of who was involved in that working group. Very suspicious, obviously. We came out and said, this is unacceptable. If you're making this decision and we don't know what voices have been included in this decision making, we don't have faith that this is being done from an unbiased perspective, especially considering she ran on a platform to become IOC president that was rooted in anti-trans exclusion as a preconceived notion, right? So that's a lot of the work that I do with Sport and Rights Alliance. And it's just a privilege to have that opportunity, because not only does it teach me about how different and broad the fight for inclusion across all sports is on the international level as well. Because like when I was living in the States and really focused my advocacy in USA women's rugby, it was a little myopic, right? Like we saw what was coming from the government and it was so disheartening all the time. And then I got to go to play the game with them and like meet people from other countries and other sports where it's like, oh, actually, not everybody hates trans people. A lot of people are confused as to why this is the case, So that's been an amazing like jumping off point for my advocacy career to have a much broader approach from an international standpoint. So yeah, I can't speak highly enough about the work that they do. And they're just run by so many badass women and folks that I'm like super, super proud to work with them on everything I get the opportunity to.
Yeah, and I think it was really telling, Sport and Rights Alliance, when they critiqued the process that Coventry used of this just nebulous female working group. Your letter was public. Like the Sport and Rights Alliance letter was public, actually, in contrast to what the IOC had done. And I think showing, not telling, is incredibly revealing in that case. But something I think there's a point you made at the beginning of we saw basically not that many bills in 2018, 2019 focusing on trans athletes. And of course, issues of inclusion, safety, abuse, these are decades old questions and concerns that we've come across, and I obviously in your work too, and with the Sport and Rights Alliance. But the question I get asked all the time, and now I get to ask the question to the expert. I get asked all the time, why trans athletes and why now? And since I am on the other end of the figurative table, I want to pose the question to you. Why trans athletes and why now?
Sure. Well, I'll continue off of the point I made about us being the easiest wedge issue for getting people comfortable with transphobia in general, right? It's like if you get to the point where you are unsure about the trans athlete question, it's a step in a radicalization pipeline to get you comfortable talking about whether we should belong in bathrooms, or whether we should have IDs that match, or whether we should have access to healthcare that keeps us alive, whether you're a child or otherwise, because they're talking about adult healthcare right now. All of these things fit into a broader political narrative that is being weaponized by fascist governments, including the United States, Christo-fascist governments, but also governments like in Hungary and in Russia, to just remove our ability to participate in public space, and it starts with sports, and starts with trans people in sports, and then it allows them to not only expand transphobia within society, but they can also say, well, those Black and brown women who have naturally higher occurring testosterone levels, is it really fair for them to compete against other female athletes if they don't take care of their, it's just really, at the end of the day, they want one very specific type of female athlete to be competing in sports, and it's the pretty, traditionally feminine white athlete, the one that we want to see on podiums in the States and other countries, right? So it's never happening in a vacuum. Trans people are just the easiest topic du jour right now, because there is such an unbelievably well-funded and well-organized hate machine that does not want to see us exist for a number of reasons. And if I want to get really metaphysical and philosophical about this, if you have an understanding of actual second wave feminism, and you look at a patriarchal power structure that oppresses not only women and non-cis men, but all of us, even if you are a man within a patriarchal society, who represents the biggest threat to a patriarchal society that's based on the idea that masculinity is the supreme power and privilege you can have in society, right? It's people who are born with it and given that power by birthright, who then, by virtue of needing to live authentically and to stay alive by accessing transition and living authentically, give that power away. I say voluntarily, it's not a choice, but for lack of a better way to explain it, voluntarily give away the power of masculinity. And by doing so, you actually break the facade of masculinity being the most powerful force in a patriarchal society. This is not a new playbook, right? If you look back at the 1930s in Germany, 1933, a lot of people don't know this, was the first book burning that was conducted by the pre-Nazi party. They weren't even in power at the time, but it was at something called the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute for Sexology in Berlin, which was the first institute of its kind in the world that studied sexual and gender variance. It's where the first gender-affirming surgeries were performed. It's where the first time that hormone replacement therapy was prescribed en masse. The head of this organization, Magnus Hirschfeld, it's a phenomenal biography that came out recently by this author named Daniel Brooks. It's called The Einstein of Sex, and he is quite literally this, Magnus person, one of my heroes. So I would recommend reading it if you're interested in it. They went to that institute in 1933, burnt it to the ground, destroyed every piece of literature and research they had ever done in the past 30 years, killed most of the people involved, and exiled Magnus outside of the country for fear of his own life. So the Nazis went after gender variant and sexually variant people first, because they knew that if you were propping up a fascist state based on this false ideal of proper traditional or Aryan masculinity, that people who had that and got rid of it prove the point that it actually isn't the most powerful thing in society, and show that the bravery in taking that power and giving it away is actually more powerful than the lies that the system's built on in the first place, right? So that's why they did it in Hungary. That's why they did it in Russia. That's why they're doing it in the US. That's why there's this huge movement in the UK with the TERF movement. It's all about protecting these power structures that at the end of the day, oppress everybody unless you are a straight, cis, white man with money. I lived that life for 25 years. I know how easy it is to live life on easy mode, right? In relative comparison to what I go through now, even though I do have a lot of privileges that I've retained. And yeah, it's laughable at this point after 7 years, because I would never start my life over and choose to be anything but a trans woman, because my capacity for understanding of power and privilege and the empathy that I have for people who have lived experiences that are not the same of mine, that I can still empathize with because I know what it's like to lose the most valuable power in society, is a gift that I think trans people uniquely receive and would be so valuable to share with the rest of our society in terms of making it a more compassionate and empathetic place.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think we are articulating it. Carly Chardonnay Webb has been on our podcast before and has articulated very similar. Like it's a wedge issue that allows the erasure of people in sport, which might be easy to get or efficient to get people in, but it's actually about the erasure of people from the political sphere, the legal sphere,
Yep.
the educate.
Yep.
It's about the erasure of people, period. And I think you've done such a great job educating us and educating our listeners on that fact, and what a powerful answer. I want to ask a little bit about the future for maybe if you could prognosticate a little bit about what do you think the future holds for trans athletes and creating inclusive spaces in sport. Is there any reason for us to be optimistic, in other words?
It's a really hard question. It's yeah, it's hard to be optimistic. It is. It's hard for me every single day to get up and think about this stuff still. The IOC decision is going to break me. I know it's going to be hard, right? Knowing that I've spent more than half a decade fighting and it doesn't matter, right? I could have been in a room with Christy Coventry and begged her on my knees to not do this because of how much harm it's going to cause and how many kids are going to die because of this hateful rhetoric that she's pushing, that she's been motivated politically by these like shadow animus groups to do so. But it doesn't matter because they don't care. They've already made the decision, Am I optimistic that in 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to see a lot of apologies for all the dead trans kids who took their own lives because they lost access to sports? Sure. We will get there. We have apologized for other atrocities we've committed against human beings in the past, whether it was banning Black and brown women from competing, or Indigenous women in Canada, or, the Lavender Scare, or, hateful homophobia throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, eventually the arc of the world bends towards justice, like Martin Luther King said, but it's just a really, really long bend, it seems. And it's a lot longer the smaller and the less powerful the group is, and the less allies we have who are willing to be vocal and speak out because they're afraid of coming under fire as well. Like, all I can say is my optimism is that I know there are people out there who care. And we see data that's coming out recently in the States that, like, overwhelmingly, this is Fox News data, 22% of voters support Democratic issues or Democratic politicians' perspectives on trans issues over Republicans, which is the largest spread of any of the topics of conversation that they actually polled people on in terms of the last election and upcoming, right? So the average person who's not in the vocal minority either is not buying this or doesn't have enough information to make an informed decision and is frankly kind of tired of all this like scapegoating and just focus on this like extremely small misunderstood group of people when they can't afford to buy eggs and their neighbors are getting ripped out of their streets and abducted or murdered literally point blank in Minnesota, right? So like there are other things that people could be caring about. Do I have optimism for all of the people who will be left in the wake of all of these hateful politics? One of the things that I talked about a couple other days with somebody is like, is there a difference between a blanket ban from all levels of a sport, like you saw in England with their football association, versus just a top level elite ban? No, there isn't. If you put a concrete ceiling on how far somebody can go in a sport relative to their peers and you change the rules for them relative to other people, why would that person who has competitive aspirations want to participate in that sport? Even myself, the difference in my ability to perform at my best from the 2 years where I didn't have to be thinking about this shit constantly to the other 5 years that I played, tremendously different, right? After the World Rugby ban, not a single moment went by when I would step on a pitch during game time where I wasn't thinking in the back of my head, If I go too hard, people are going to say it's unfair. If I, God forbid, hurt somebody, unlike what happened to me, am I going to end up on Fox News and Tucker Carlson, right? Like, those are the things that are going in the back of my head when I'm trying to compete at my best and be the best teammate for the people that I play with. And that is something you should not have to be worrying about in a sporting environment, which is literally meant to take away all of those things that you deal with outside, you know? Did I get better at managing those fears as I continued to play and was continued to be supported and uplifted by my teammates? Sure. Could I have played at a higher, more competitive level sooner had I not been holding myself back in that way? Absolutely. If I was myself looking at joining rugby now in the state of affairs that we have in this conversation, there is no way in hell I would have accepted the invitation to jump on the pitch. And that's a tragedy for every single person who's either being pushed out of a sport or who is now, as a young trans girl in particular, not even going to be comfortable or willing to entertain the idea of joining a sport in the first place, right? So am I optimistic? In the short term, no. In the medium term, probably not. In the long term, I know that the world is a just place. And I know that people on a baseline are not hateful individuals, as much as it seems like there's a lot of people with hate in their heart in this country, which is callous and is hard for me to understand as a trans woman. But I do know that seeing what the rhetoric around trans inclusion more broadly in society was like in the mid 2010s in the US, with the tipping point, with Laverne Cox, with Elliot Page, with all of these amazing things, you know, when I came out, I was like, wow, people actually, like, it's safe for me finally to be myself, you know. And then watching this backslide happen, it will come back up, right? Social progress is a spiral staircase. It's not just one that you walk straight up, and it's sometimes 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, but you do eventually get to where you're going.
This has been just so like, I could listen to you talk for my entire life and, like,
Oh,
live a very satisfied life, but the things you've said have been so powerful and poignant and just, like, dead on in precise and polished and, yeah, I just can't say enough good things. Like, there aren't enough good words to convey, how how I feel about this conversation, how I feel about you.
thank you.
Um and so I think to close out though, in helping us move this arc and bring us back almost to the 2010s, if we will, if not further, and moving even more towards an inclusive, empathetic, and just space. For our listeners and for us too, what is one thing, two things that we or anyone else who cares about this issue can do to help move this needle, move down this arc, even just a little bit, towards making sport the vision and idea that we want it to be in terms of equity, inclusion, and justice?
Amazing question. The number one most important thing you can do is only talk about trans people when you're talking with a trans person, right? Like, it's one thing to just have a bunch of talking heads, even if they're like allies, right? Talking about the trans issue or where trans people fit into sport. If there is not a trans person in your panel, in your podcast that you're interviewing for your newsletter, and you are talking about our existence, I don't trust a fucking word that you're saying, because you have not taken it upon yourself to actually speak to the people who are impacted. And that kind of objective reporting or whatever is how we got here in the first place. That's how rampant misinformation was able to permeate through the New York Times, because they wrote all these bullshit articles about trans kids or about trans athletes. You know, I'm one of few trans people that they ever actually interviewed. And this was 6 years ago when they pretended to give a shit about whether we lived or died, you know? But we got here because we talked about trans people and not to trans people. I will say to the trans people and the trans athletes out there, especially the trans women, I know it's scary, and I'm not calling upon you to do this sort of work if you don't feel safe or comfortable to do so. But if you have the privileges that I do, and you feel safe and you feel comfortable and willing and articulate to speak about your experience, there are people like you guys and other folks out there who are willing to hear your stories. You can reach out to me. I'll get you in touch with people. I'll help you workshop how you can tell your story. It is the most important thing you can do, because we need an oral history of your existence. We need an oral history of your resistance. We need an oral history of where you fit in sports and where people in the future can fit. Because I really hope there's going to be some trans girl or a parent of a trans kid who's going to watch this podcast and say, hey, maybe it's okay for us to fight. Maybe it's okay for you to actually go to that soccer practice or whatever the case may be. And that person is going to become the advocate 10 years down the road, saying that, like, everything you've heard is bullshit. I have found joy and I have found acceptance and I have had radical experiences of inclusion in the sports that I've played. And it's changed my life for the better. And it's the reason that I'm still alive.
We need an oral history of your existence and an oral history of your resistance. I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
That's such a brilliant phrase and way to put it. And no better way to close this episode. Thank you so much, so much for coming on The End of Sport and sharing your work, your life, your history, all of that with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you both for covering this. It's really important.